So now we are going to go ahead and discuss departmental costing and cost allocation. In the last chapter, chapter 5, we discussed organizational costing, which is basically the relationship between cost, volume, and profit. If you remember the relationship we studied as profit analysis, it looked at mainly how cost affect volume and how volume affect profits. So you saw that as we increase the volume, the variable cost decreases and vice versa. In this chapter, we introduce what is called departmental costing. Now, that is a different classification of cost because in this, we are trying to analyze the relationship between cost and department. Some costs are organizational in nature and are incurred at the level of the organization, but there are other costs that are at the department level. So it becomes necessary to allocate such costs to the individual departments. Direct versus indirect costs. So, in addition to the relationship to volume, which we saw in chapter 5, the costs can also be classified into direct and indirect. So, the way they are related to the unit or activity. So, direct is when the costs are unique and exclusive to the department. So, for example, if you look at lab, the salaries of managers, the salaries of lab technicians, cost of equipment, the chairs that you sit on and get the blood drawn, cost of that, supplies for testing like test tubes, um, gloves and syringes and so forth. All of that is directly related to lab. But there are some indirect costs as well, which are costs that are associated with shared resources. So, for example, if the lab is housed in the same building as the hospital or the ambulatory care center, and they are using only maybe like one or two rooms, they are sharing the cost of the rent. The rent is being paid by the entire organization, but two rooms of rent are allocated to the lab, and that is why we are studying cost allocation here. So, due to being shared, indirect costs are very difficult to measure at the department level. And the other feature about indirect cost is that if the lab was closed, let's say, if you went ahead and closed the lab and you say that I'm not going to offer lab services anymore at my hospital, the indirect cost will not disappear. You will still be paying the rent, right? Even if that those two rooms are empty, you will still be paying the rent for those two rooms. So these classifications will be used to assign costs to departments within an organization. So there are some cost allocation basics. Note that the two cost allocation categories overlap with one another. So as we saw in chapter 5, there is fixed cost and variable cost, but at the same time there is direct cost and indirect cost. So under fixed, you see that there is an illustration showing, almost 50% is direct and the other half is indirect. In variable, there is a large percentage of direct, as you can imagine. Direct is related with salaries of staff and managers, and there is a small portion that is indirect. Indirect cost, there is again a 50-50 division of fixed and variable cost. In the indirect cost, the fixed cost is more and the variable cost is less. It's basically the opposite of the pictures here on the left. The right side is just the opposite of the pictures on the left. So what happens is managers get promotion and compensation based on profitability. The cost allocation process should be fair if managers are held accountable for both direct and indirect costs of their departments. So the goal is to assign all of the cost of an organization to activities that cause them to be incurred. Health managers understand what services should be offered, how those services should be priced, and those are the learnings that you get from cost allocation. The goal of cost allocation is to assign all overhead costs to the department that create the need for such cost, for example, patient services departments. The overhead departments are often called as cost centers, while patient services departments are called revenue centers because they are directly generating revenue. So we have to define two terms that are used in cost allocation. Then we will illustrate the two methods of cost allocation. So the first thing that we need to understand is cost pool. Cost pool is a grouping of similar cost to be allocated. Cost driver is the basis on which the allocation is made. So a cost pool is the overhead amount to be allocated. In general, a cost pool consists of the direct costs of one overhead department. However, if the cost of a single overhead department substantially differs, then and it is used in different proportions, then multiple cost pools should be used. For example, financial services overhead can be divided into billings and budgeting cost pool. So if there is a finance department in your hospital, there is a group of people who are doing billing and collections, who are billing the patients. They're collecting all of the fees from patients. Well, there is another department that is budgeting and forecasting and planning for the hospital's financials, right? What we are studying, they're doing all of that. But then there is other department the first department that is actively, sending emails to patients, sending letters to patients, and collecting revenue from them. Another example is that the cost of a hospital housekeeping department might be allocated to other departments on the basis of the size of each department's physical space. So total housekeeping cost would be the cost pool, and the number of square feet of occupied space would be the cost driver. For housekeeping, the allocation rate is the total housekeeping cost divided by the square footage that is occupied by departments that receive allocation. Cost driver is the basis on which the cost pool will be allocated. Okay, so for example, the cost driver for facilities overhead, for example, the building space depreciation, maintenance, utilities, and so on, that might be the amount of space used by each department that uses the organization's facilities. So if let's say lab is using 50 square feet of space, that is the amount of space lab is using, so that is the cost driver for lab. But let's say we are looking at the ICU, and the ICU is using 5,000 square feet of space, that is the cost driver for ICU. So just keep in mind that cost driver is the basis on which the allocation is made, but cost pool is the grouping of similar costs that has to be allocated. When we are doing cost allocation, we are pricing process where managers allocate the cost of one department to other departments. Overhead cost allocation is a pain, and why is it necessary? Suppose a hospital uses amount of space occupied as the cost driver for the allocation of housekeeping services. Does this driver have the attributes of a good driver? So it is a pain, because in some cases you may need to create two cost pools for one department. Patient billing can be used by financial services, and patient billing can be used more by the routine care department. Lab uses less budgeting services than routine care department, so it becomes very complicated. Even if financial services is the one that is doing patient billing is also used by routine care department to some extent. And lab also uses budgeting services because even they need to do their own financial budgeting and planning, all of that. The lab manager will do it, and there will be a CFO and some managers for the hospital level under them who will be doing more financial budgeting and planning for the hospital itself. But the routine care department has more cost allocated for budgeting as compared to lab, but still they do. So that is why it becomes very complicated. So there is a few steps which we will discuss for allocation process. The first step is identifying the cost pool. So identify the cost pool, which is the dollar cost of the overhead activity to be allocated. So how many dollars do you have that need to be allocated? And so, for example, assume that a hospital's housekeeping department has direct cost of $100,000. Okay, so you want to allocate that $100,000 in a certain way, and you need to know how much is that cost pool. So the cost pool is housekeeping department's $100,000, the whole sum of money. Now, the cost driver has to be determined, and that is the basis on which overhead cost can be allocated. Um, if you remember from a couple of slides ago, we said that the amount of space is the one that is the cost driver. So now let's say that the cost driver for housekeeping services is the amount of space occupied. So the user departments in total occupy 200,000 square feet of space. So you have lab, you have ICU, you have radiology, you have pediatrics, all of those departments that are using housekeeping services, because there is a housekeeping service that goes and does the cleaning and the mopping and like sanitizing every day over there. And all of these people share 200,000 square feet of departments share 200,000 square feet of space. Now we use those two numbers to calculate the allocation rate. So the formula for allocation rate is dollars in cost pool divided by total volume of cost drive. So the allocation rate is the numerical value used to make the allocation. And here the allocation rate will be $100,000, which was the cost pool money for housekeeping, if you remember. And then we said that 200,000 square feet of space is being not used by housekeeping. It's not like housekeeping department is using 200,000 of space to do their activities, but they are using housekeeping to come and clean and all of that. So all of those departments have 200,000 of square feet space that is being serviced by housekeeping. So 100,000 divided by 200,000 gives you 0.5 cents, 50 cents per square footage of space occupied. So the allocation rate for housekeeping is 50 cents per square footage of space. And then you will determine the allocation amount. Let me see. Yeah. And then you'll determine the allocation amount. So each user department is then allocated some portion of housekeeping overhead cost. So let's say the critical care department occupies 10,000 square feet of space, right? They are huge and they occupy 10,000 square feet of space. So their allocation rate would be 50 cents. Their allocation would be the allocation rate, which is 50 cents. We just saw on this slide, 50 cents per square foot of space, and then you multiply it with 10,000 square feet for critical care department, and we allocate $5,000 of housekeeping that critical care department is using. So whatever allocation rate you obtain, you multiply with the square footage of department to get the allocation amount in dollars.